Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub looks at crop conditions to the north. Bob Klein talks about safely using Dicamba. Steve Melvin discusses crop water needs, and Brad Lubben describes research looking at precision ag profitability. Elaine Kub is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. U.S. farmers this spring planted nearly 91 million acres of corn and 89.5 million acres of soybeans. Those numbers were released Friday in two key USDA reports and may have helped prices for the commodities shoot higher. In 3 sessions, July corn added 22 cents and July soybeans increased 60 cents. But spring wheat has been the real star. In just 2 weeks, the July Minneapolis wheat contract jumped $1.62. That's largely attributed to drought conditions in North Dakota and in South Dakota, where Elaine joined us from Wednesday afternoon. We started our conversation by asking about current conditions in her north-central area of the state.
They are pretty grim. It is depressing going around here. I'm standing in a spring wheat field that has been zeroed out for insurance and just baled up. That's pretty widespread. So there will be some spring wheat fields that do get harvested, you know, on the fringes where this drought isn't so bad, this pocket of drought. But by and large, we're talking not only a loss of planted acreage, you know, we saw that in the acreage report last week, that overall spring wheat was down 6% year over year. We're talking losses of total fields that get zeroed out like this one. And then we're talking really grim yield prospects for anything that does get harvested.
Well, is there a substantial threat to that corn and soybean crop as well then?
Absolutely. So this is a very widespread drought. You look, 99.9% of North Dakota is in some kind of a drought. So all of that corn, all of that soybeans, all of the pulses that are grown in North Dakota, the canola, the flaxseed that is pretty much primarily grown in North Dakota, all of that is going to be looking at major yield drawdowns. Now, for the corn and soybean markets, how much that plays into the overall U.S. production, it's not as significant as the specialty crops or the spring wheat that are primarily grown in this region.
Let's talk about this crazy ride we've been on here for the past about 3 sessions. How much of it is due to what we're seeing in spring wheat or the overall weather conditions, the weather forecast, and USDA's report on Friday?
I would say almost 0% to spring wheat, because we're really not in a scenario where even the Kansas wheat, that is a low protein this year, so it can't really even come into that high protein milling wheat market. So almost none of that is carrying over into the other markets. The acreage reports, I think, has largely been ignored, or at least if it had bearish implications, it didn't really play into the prices. So I think almost all of the rally that we've seen this week is due to the weather. And I'm sure Al Dutcher is going to touch on, you know, this ridge of hot, dry weather that's parked over the western corn belt at a really unfortunate time for corn production.
Yeah, he'll have the answer for you, Elaine, don't worry. How much of it is fun covering?
Well, that's, I think, that explosiveness. So even going into the report, into last week, you still had the speculators were net short in soybeans, net short in corn, and they were kind of going both ways. They hadn't made up their minds to become bullish on the markets yet. But I think once those reports got out of the way, including the grain stocks report, I think then they felt free to really concentrate on this weather, which is very concerning, especially for the western corn belt. And I think now that's why we're seeing this explosive movement this week is short covering from the funds.
What is basis done, at least up there in that area, as the futures have gone crazy?
Well, for spring wheat basis, it has sort of pulled back. I mean, and part of that is just the switching to the September contract. You'll always see some spurts and jumps around from that. The hard red winter wheat basis has improved a little bit a couple months ago, but has stayed steady since then. Corn and soybeans, day to day, we do see slight pullbacks. It gets weaker by a penny or so when you see the rallies like this, but it hasn't really fallen apart. You're talking about Midwestern processor level basis bids still at that 36 under level.
What do you think the meat was in Friday's reports?
Well, I don't know that it really matters so much that it wasn't. I think it's already priced into this year, but I think it's interesting to think about the scenario that eventually we're going to have a year when there's more soybean acres than corn acres. So Friday showed 90.9 million acres of corn and less than that of soybeans. But someday we're going to see more of that as we continue to be the market that Asia comes to for its soy protein.
So was that a surprise then that it wasn't higher? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that there were some expectations. Some traders, some funds did expect to see soybeans beat corn on the acreage number. And it probably as a result of the prevent planting that happened this spring. That is potentially why we didn't see that happen yet this year.
Any demand implications from Friday's reports?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, especially the grain stocks report that showed the inventories that are sitting in the bins still, that was more interesting as far as the carryover, what we're going to end up with at the end of this marketing year, and it's still very large. I mean, it's hard to get real bullish for old crop grain when you consider how much is still sitting around in bins, but I do think that these yield problems, if they continue, especially during June or July that we're in now, that's something that can add some bullish fervor on all of the contracts.
So individually, where do you think prices go here?
Well, so when I left my desk, December corn futures were above $4, and soybean futures were possibly, within range of striking $10. Spring wheat was above $8. So it's really, this is really the moment where we have to decide if we're going to be rallying through the summer because the weather gets worse. I honestly think it's a question for Al more than me. If this July heat is widespread through the center of the Corn Belt, through Nebraska and Iowa, areas like that really start to drag down yield, then I think we are often running above that $4 level, toward $4.50, $5. It depends how long and how bad it gets.
What does that mean for selling then? Just a gamble?
I think if you are someplace that has good yield prospects and you don't have anything sold yet, here's your $4 that you may have been waiting for the past months and wish that you still had. Here's that opportunity. But if you're somewhere that you are worried about your own yields and you've already got something sort of on the books, I would wait and see. This is really the moment to be watching those weather forecasts.
Same in beans?
Same in beans, absolutely. And beans, just agronomically and on the markets, we always tend to see them follow the corn rally a couple of weeks later. That's just when they tend to be at their point of the most risk. We're seeing that this year, and I am heartened to see that the speculators are recognizing that the beans too are affected by this hot, dry weather. So same exact advice, just really be watching those weather forecasts.
Next week, Doug Simon from Trados will join us to look at corn and soybean markets, and Iowa State Extension livestock economist Lee Schultz will be with us to recap the USDA's latest quarterly hogs and pigs report. The use of Dicamba continues to cause issues for farmers in southern states. As we told you last November, the use of an unapproved formulation led to damage in nearby crops during the 2016 growing season. Those issues have intensified. Arkansas may now ban the use of in-crop dicamba after receiving hundreds of misuse complaints. As Bob Klein said when we talked last week, Nebraska Extension researchers, including Stephen Knezevic, have tried to measure the damage even small doses can cause. We talked with Bob near Clay Center, Nebraska, and began by asking about the challenges and benefits of using dicamba.
Well, one of the things, they can control a lot of the broadleaf weeds, which we have a problem with in controlling with the glyphosate-resistant weeds or other resistance that we have. And we have a number of other resistances that cropped up. So it gives us another tool here, which is very important in dealing with resistant weeds.
Can weeds also develop resistance to dicamba, though?
Yes, that can occur, and we did work several years ago out at North Platte, and we found out repeated applications of dicamba we could run in resistance very fast. So we want to make sure we use it in crop rotations and so forth, and use some alternate herbicides and so forth in controlling those weeds, so we can keep that good tool available to us when we need it.
Now let's talk about the challenges. What
Yeah.
specifically can happen when you spray dicamba?
Well, of course, the new formulations really help on volatility. They really have improved that. So that can really help a lot, even at higher temperatures. You know, the old formulations and so forth, when you start getting the 80s and so forth, we could start having problems. So the main thing we're concerned about is the spray particle drift, as well as sprayer clean out and so forth. These can be major problems.
Can you tell me more about the drift, how much of a problem it can be?
Yeah, well, one of the things we've gone to nozzles, which give us a much larger particle size. Most of these particle sizes are in the ultra coarse category, which is huge. In many cases, especially on smaller weeds, I like to increase that spray volume above the 10-gallon minimum on most labels.
Extension has done some work trying to find out just how much can be a problem outside of what you're spraying. Tell me about that.
Well, that's right. As you get to the low volumes and so forth and big particle size, you don't get the coverage you need. Now, when you have big weeds, it seems like you get away with the lower gallonage and so forth. But when you have small little weeds, and that's when you want to control them, it really takes the good coverage on that. And with the large particle size, of course, to reduce spray particle drift, we got to increase that volume.
So how much dicamba can cause a problem for things that you might not want to cause a problem for?
Well, some work that Knizovic done in northeast Nebraska and so forth, and he got down to a rates of 1/500th of the normal rate, which is about 1/5 of a teaspoon, and that's the smaller one. The bigger one's a tablespoon, and sprayed on a whole acre, and it still caused injury and so forth. So it doesn't take much to cause the injury like the tomatoes, grapes, or even conventional soybeans.
You had mentioned tank clean out earlier. How important is it?
Yeah, it's really important with products like Dicamba and so forth, because that can build up in the end of the spray booms and so forth, or in the tank. And then where that really dissolves is when you've got time for, when you put glyphosate or something else in there, it can clean out that. And it can really cause some major injury, which we've seen over the years. So really follow the label guidelines on sprayer clean out and do a good job with the tanks.
There are probably people who have read about the dicamba issues to the south. Is it, when you think about people spraying it here, do you have the same type of concerns?
Well, we always want to be concerned about it and so forth, but I think we've got, probably a little bit more knowledgeable applicators and so forth that can really do a good job. We provide a lot of training, but you got to really pay attention to the label and do all those things, or you can have some major problems. It can be used, and it's like anything else. Even a boat can be a problem and so forth if you drive it recklessly or something like that. And the same thing with these herbicides. If you use them recklessly or don't follow the label and so forth, you can get in trouble. But it provides us a real good tool, and we like to keep that tool because of the fact that it really helps us with some of the problems we're having dealing with resistant weeds today.
We'll have more from the Clay Center Field Day next week, as we'll talk about Nebraska Extension research on balance bean with Amit Jala. The Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center, formerly known as the ARDC, will hold 4 crop management diagnostic clinics in July and August. The clinics will provide research and plot demonstrations on corn and soybean production, as well as soil health and precision ag. Nebraska Extension's Keith Glewen outlines the events.
The crop management and diagnostic clinic infield training programs are scheduled in the month of July and August this year. Specifically, we have a soil health training scheduled for July 18th here at this site. And this is a really important clinic because no matter if you're a homeowner with a garden or if you've got 10,000 acres of corn, soil is a very important part of our life. And we'll be instructing participants on the different physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil. Then on the 2nd of August, we have a precision ag clinic, and we will have a soybean production clinic on the 23rd of August and a corn production clinic on the 24th of August. And part of the reason you see areas behind me that are not planted yet, we will have corn and soybeans at all different stages of growth, including physiological maturity for those trainings in August.
The cost to attend a clinic is $95 if registered a week in advance, or $120 at the door. For more information, you can visit nrec.unl.edu, or you can contact your local Nebraska Extension office. The July Nebraska farmer says Don Gasper is no stranger to no-till. He's used the practice for the last 36 years on his farm near Lindsay. 6 years ago, he began incorporating cereal rye cover crops into his corn-soybean rotation with the help of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. In the July Nebraska Farmer, you can read about the benefits Gasper has noticed from using cover crops and no-till. The USDA's latest progress report rates 75% of Nebraska's corn as good to excellent, with 8% listed as silking. In soybeans, 28% is blooming, 9 points ahead of the state's 5-year average. Meanwhile, 70% of the crop is categorized as good to excellent. At Nebraska Extension's recent field day in Clay Center, we talked with Steve Melvin about crop water needs throughout the growing season. We started by asking about irrigation management in corn.
Yeah, for corn, drought stress is not a big concern, moderate drought stress before tassel time. And so, this year's been very dry and hot, and we've used a lot of water, and we certainly need some irrigation on some fields. But we always want to think about taking the opportunity during the vegetative stage with corn to give some moderate drought stress to it. It just has several benefits.
You recently wrote on Crop Watch about this topic and talked about the water miser strategy. Tell me about that.
Well, the water miser strategy is some work that's been done at University of Nebraska as well as other places. It shows that drought stress on corn during the vegetative stage really doesn't affect the yield very much. If you have too significant, of course it will, but some moderate drought stress, some leaf rolling in the afternoon, come harvest time, you won't see a difference between that and what was fully watered. So it provides an opportunity to think about it. But then the water miser strategy, when you get to tassel time, you want to make sure the crop's fully watered. The flowering stage or pollen time is the most sensitive time for corn with drought stress. So you want to make sure that whatever you do, you're aiming to have it in really good condition at pollination and early grain fill.
At that point, that's when we really start to think about yield impact?
Absolutely, absolutely. A little bit of drought stress at that time will have a major impact on yield.
What are the water needs around that time that you need to start thinking about?
Well, you just want to have it fully watered, and so it just depends on the weather that we're having. Sometimes it might be only, 1/1500ths or 2/10 of an inch a day if it's, a cooler day. If it's a really hot, dry, windy day, it could be, 3500ths or 4/10 of an inch pretty easy.
And when do you look at that through? So at what point in corn do you have to maybe not worry about irrigation quite as much?
Well, once you get to the dough stage, then we can start backing off just a little bit. I mean, by the time of year, the days are getting a lot shorter sunlight time, and it's usually cooling off. The plant, of course, has a full, deep, root zone, and so we can start backing off a little bit then in early part of August, and then start shortening it a little bit on the water. Wait an extra day or two before we start irrigating, and try and use up some of that subsoil moisture that's still there. And that doesn't affect yield either.
I should ask about the root zones. I mean, I think some people are worried that if they were in a wetter situation earlier on in the year, the root system isn't developed enough and it can't get down to the water, and therefore they might need to develop. Can you address that?
Well, once in a while we can have some issues that way, but for the most part, I mean, you want to monitor it and keep track of it. With soil probes, always, a good friend when you're scouting those kinds of things. But for the most part, we can pretty much always count on corn having a good root system. That's by tassel time we're down to 3 feet, and then later we configure down to 4 feet and use the water up a little bit deeper.
How different are soybeans when it comes to irrigation?
Well, with soybeans, there's been a lot of research done over the years. It really doesn't show a lot of impact from drought stress early either. I mean, that's kind of a general thing with a grain crop. We can, as long as we keep the plant moving along. I've seen some times when it was really hot and dry, and we really need to keep enough water on the soybeans so the plant develops and you've got a nice full canopy, a big plant to go to work when it gets to putting grain in the pods. But up until the middle of July, we really don't need to worry too much about it with soybeans either. And then, of course, during the end of July and into August is when they really respond well to irrigation.
You can find more information about crop water needs in Steve's recent article on the Crop Watch website. University of Nebraska-Lincoln researchers say higher adoption of precision ag is associated with higher profitability on the farm. However, they can't say definitively using those tools causes the rise in net farm income. The topic was the focus of a recent Cornhusker economics article from UNL professors Brad Lubben, Joe Luck, and Taro Mino, and former UNL Ag Economics grad student Mike Castle. The researchers sampled data from producers working with Nebraska Farm Business Inc. to learn more about use and returns. Brad joined us recently to discuss the subject and how this analysis is different from previous work on precision ag.
There are very few analyses out there where we actually look at real economic results. There's a lot of analysis of precision ag technology and the potential returns. Budget out the potential returns of adopting variable rate applications or section controls or other new technologies. And you can assess what's potential, but you don't know exactly what is realized in terms of how a producer uses it on their operation.
Give me an idea of what your data showed for your producers.
Right. The first case is maybe the most obvious. It's precision agriculture technology adoption seems to be strongly correlated with increased profitability. But then the fundamental statistical question, but which caused which? We know there was rapid adoption over the last decade or two. We know there was also substantially increasing profits in the early 2000s. And so did precision ag technology adoption drive increased profitability? Or did increased profitability create those capital reserves to adopt new technology? Or in fact, did they drive each other, which certainly is a very possible case as well.
Did you break it down by different technologies, so different precision ag tools?
Right. At least initially here, we see a range of different technologies adopted, everything from yield monitor and information to section controls and automatic guidance and variable rate applications. But in the initial analysis here, we're just looking at sort of a family of precision ag technologies. So yet to study perhaps individual technologies and the impact of one or the other, but simply more of a management perception or perspective of adopting a family of technology and looking at the profitability, not just of adopting or not adopting, but the profitability changes of before adoption versus after adoption.
Right, explain more on that, the difference you saw from maybe year 1 to 10 years out.
What might be expected is that looking at the profitability of individual operations before and after adoption, well, what really happens after adoption? And the best model that we could initially at least address here looks more like an S-shaped curve, a sigmoid curve as we would call it, that really looks like a learning curve. The initial years of adoption, there's not particularly much impact. It might even be negative on profitability, which is to say you make investment decisions, maybe you expense those decisions from a tax basis, so you have expenses, but you don't have a lot of benefits. Well, some of that is because you're learning how to use the technology. Some of that is because, consider a yield monitor, until you have enough years of data, you really don't have something to act upon, no information to really make a management decision. Enough time passes, and when you look at technology times years used, the further you go, the bigger the impact. And eventually we would model, you would imagine that you've gotten the full benefit of it and profits start to level off.
So the take-home question, does precision ag increase profits?
The initial analysis would still leave that question out there hanging. It certainly supports the idea that there's a learning curve, that you get better at the technology as time goes on, and so one expects profitability to increase as time goes on. But the fundamental question of how profitable, we could still use better data and further analysis to hone in on exactly which technologies are profitable where, and which technologies may be more challenging yet.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, taking a look at this last week, we did see scattered convection on almost a daily basis across the state, with the most concentrated areas of significant moisture located in pockets of southwest, south central, and southeastern Nebraska. We actually had totals unofficially reported up to 4 inches in extreme south central Nebraska due to some thunderstorm activity. But farther north, most of the thunderstorms that developed were very spotty in nature and did not contain much in the way of significant moisture. Therefore, we've seen continued deterioration in some of those abnormally dry areas we depicted last week, and we've introduced moderate drought conditions to portions of northeast Nebraska, including the northeastern sandhills. If this dryness issue continues throughout the weekend into early next week, the next drought monitor will likely reflect some of those drying conditions in portions of the western sandhills and southwest Nebraska that would be next up for upgrades to moderate drought conditions. So, do we have chances for rain in the forecast? Let's take a look at the upper air model. The thing I'll draw your attention to is, once again, we have high pressure in place in the upper atmosphere over the central Rockies, northwest flow that clips Nebraska at the surface. We have surface low basically down in the southeastern Colorado and up into the eastern Montana, western Dakotas. And precipitation with those systems is expected to generate some scattered showers across western Nebraska, but nothing significant. And as we go into tomorrow, the high pressure system starts to expand a little bit more toward the east. Although we do show surface lows developing, the atmosphere is likely going to be highly capped in our region, and therefore very weak chances of scattered precipitation, primarily to the east and south of us. And then as we get into Monday, the high pressure system begins to expand to the east, and we are going to see the heat build rapidly in the Central Plains. Low pressure once again at the surface showing up, but again the atmosphere is going to be very capped, and most of the thunderstorm activity will lie across areas to the east of us, and we start to see the tropical moisture feeding up into the central Rockies. Tuesday, the high pressure expands even farther toward the east of us. Still surface lows in the area. Again, the atmosphere will be very capped with the very warm temperatures expected across the Central Plains. And in terms of precipitation, we get the monsoon flow in the Central Rockies and the cold front moving through the Great Lakes region. Then as we get into Wednesday, that high pressure system kind of slides a little bit to the east, and that may allow a little bit more monsoon moisture to get into our region, as once again we still see a thermal low at the surface in northwestern Kansas, and then we start to see some of that moisture feeding around that low into the western portion of the state, giving us at least some isolated thunderstorm activity. And as Thursday, we start to see the ridge flattening out and trying to build back toward the west. Surface lows still in place. Some of that monsoon moisture probably is going to ride around these surface lows and actually move into portions of northern Nebraska and southern Minnesota. And then as we go into Friday, high pressure expands rapidly toward the west and covers a large portion of the United States. We still have a surface low in place over western Kansas, and that will still allow some moisture from the monsoon flow to feed up into portions of western Nebraska, but primarily the remainder of the state remains dry. 8 to 14 day period indicates from next Thursday following Tuesday, very warm conditions still remain in place. And in terms of precipitation, we're looking at below normal precipitation. One quick word on the cattle stress index, we are showing high values beginning on Monday, maximizing as we get in the Wednesday, Thursday time period, and then starting to decrease as we go into next weekend.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, spraying Dicamba, crop water needs, and precision ag profitability. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Doug Simon will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Lee Schultz will look at the latest inventory of hogs and pigs. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.